grew up in Leeds, did my masters in Leeds, so I'm very much a Leeds person, don't worry. I'm actually going to be talking about history today, not health, and probably history that you guys lived through. You'll probably be able to tell me more about it today. And my MA dissertation within community politics in the 1970s and the 1980s, but today I'm going to focus on the 1970s. So in this presentation, I will focus on some of the ways in which black women cared for children and young people in order to demonstrate the role of women within the protection of community in Leeds, specifically the black community. I will specifically focus on black women's involvement in militancy, which was a defining characteristic of the 1970s for all British people, whether they were black power activists protesting in the streets or factory workers striking against poor conditions. By having this focus, I hope to change our traditional understandings of militancy and who participates in it. We often associate militancy with violence and disorder because that is how often the government and the media represents it to us. In truth, militancy does not mean any of these things. The Cambridge Dictionary defines militancy as the fact of being active, determined, and often willing to use force. So using that definition, strikes are an example of militancy. Even peaceful marches are examples of militancy because they're confrontational. And over the months recently, we have seen attempts to tarnish the reputations of ordinary workers such as trained staff, nurses, doctors, teachers, people who make up our community, because they have dared to demand better from their employers. Strikes and other militant actions are essential because they have historically improved our rights, both as citizens and workers, which is why it's important for us to show solidarity rather than allow the government and the media to divide us, especially because militancy is something that many black people in Chapeltown throughout the 1970s involved themselves in varying degrees. We need to dispense with the idea that everyone who engaged in militant action looked like this. Because as we'll see throughout this presentation, this masculine and violent image of militancy is not reflective of the reality of most black women activists in Britain. So to demonstrate how black women engaged in or responded to militant action, I will focus on 3 case studies: the Studley Grange playgroup takeover of 1972, the Cowper Street school strike of 1973, now known as Hillcrest Academy, and the Bonfire Night uprising of 1975. So in Chapeltown, Caribbean migrants often worried for their children. Not only were young black boys more likely to be stopped by the police due to stop and search laws, children often encountered racism in education from their teachers and sometimes their fellow classmates. Parents were also eager to provide a rich environment for their children in Britain. At a UCA and parents meeting in June 1973, Annette Leiber, pictured on our screen, shared a document she had written for the parents, in which she declared that in the Caribbean islands, the child was left to develop naturally, but the English way of life puts him in a completely different situation, and this was due to the deficient infrastructure of Chapeltown at the time because the community centres rarely funded them. She wrote that it was, quote, the responsibility of the intelligent mother to use all her faculties if her child is to develop its full potentials, as well as Leiber's language reflects her personal situation as a single mother in Leeds, as well as the relationship between women and children that stems from maternal Caribbean cultures and practices. However, in Britain, many Caribbean women had to balance their responsibilities as mothers along with the need to work as first-generation migrants. Therefore, despite their limited time for activism, the injustices that the children and other children were subjected to motivated so-called ordinary women, alongside men, to directly challenge the state in ways that perhaps they previously weren't comfortable with, particularly in the Caribbean. And the assumption of such maternal roles by women within the community hints at the way in which community activism is often gendered. So black women involved themselves in the Chapeltown Parents and Friend Association, which I'll refer to as the CPFA, and it was formed to challenge racism and paternalism within the Studley Grange Playgroup Committee, which many of you might be familiar with. Caribbean mothers initiated the playgroup around 1963, but white professionals from middle-class areas dominated the committee by November 1972. according to the coverage provided by Chapeltown News, a community newspaper, public demands for greater diversity within the committee were countered with warnings that funds would be cut if responsible people were not in control. Infuriated by the implication that black people were irresponsible, locals accused the committee of displaying a paternalistic attitude towards black people. The CPFA, spearheaded by Mrs. Verrill Harriott, was created to address this issue, and the organisation sometimes assumed a militant tone due to its leaders' membership of the West Indian Afro Brotherhood, which is pictured on the screen. A pro-black organisation which was described as, quote, the largest black militant organisation in Leeds. A document published by the CPFA named White Power Struggle for Control of Multiracial Play Centre criticised white liberals and conveyed the revolutionary sentiment of black power. Control of this is a quote by the way, control of a country, a school, or, as in this case, a children's centre has got to be taken, and that's taken in capital letters there. The document persuaded a crowd of black parents to actually interrupt a meeting at the playgroup between the committee on the 24th of November, and Mrs. Harriott there criticised the committee for, quote, muzzling the power of the people, end quote. A new committee was eventually elected, with Mrs. Harriott pictured on the left as its chairperson, and Mrs. Lucilla Winter, the wife of another founder of the WIB, Mr. Trevor Winter, as the organiser, and you can see her on the right there as well. So the Chapeltown Parents Action Group, the CPAG, was a different organisation formed a year later, in June 1973. It was formed by parents who were concerned about the conditions of the local Cowper Street school, the school which most black parents in Chapeltown sent their children to. A new study by Bernard Cord had revealed the high rates at which Caribbean children were being labelled as educationally subnormal, and the success of the local supplementary schools, established by volunteers such as Mrs. Verrill Harriott and Mrs. Gertrude Paul, proved that state classrooms were in fact damaging to black children. These factors were galvanised by the fact that Mrs. Gertrude Paul, a local activist and new teacher at the school, had complained about the racist remarks that the head teacher had made about the black pupils, such as black children having reduced cranial capacities that affected their intelligence, which of course we know is not true.
Can I just say something?
Yeah?
I was at that march. I was 7.
7?
Yeah, I was 7 years old.
Wow. Thank you for letting me know that, because usually when I present this history, especially as a university student, I'm doing it in conferences in London or around the country, and now I can actually do it to a community I'm writing about, and I can hear from you and from the people who have participated in these events. So thank you. I'd love to speak to you later.
It's one of my earliest memories, standing there, being one of those children who was there at the meeting. Mr. Butler was the headmaster, and he wouldn't give us a fair shake. According to adults that I've spoken to since, we weren't given a fair chance to succeed at that school because of his racist attitude.
Definitely, thank you. So such revelations about the school inspired local radical activists Calvin Beach and Arthur France to create the CPAG. However, they made a conscious decision to not get too involved and position black mothers as the driving forces of the organisation. So Beach and France had declared that they wanted the organisation to be associated with kinship instead of radicalism, and they were getting quite a reputation for being radicals. And whereas if it wasn't associated with radicalism, they would be able to get more support within the community and also evade scrutiny from the state. So they encouraged Viola Hendrickson, formerly Violet Hendrickson, a member of the young radical arts group Uhuru Arts, to become the new secretary of the organisation. And they also ensured that older mothers at the school, who were revered within the neighbourhood, took up leadership roles too. So Mrs. Odessa Stout was a respectable married Barbadian mother who chaired the CPAG, and like most black people at the time, she did not fit the stereotypical image of the militant activist we saw at the beginning. However, later reflecting on her involvement in 1992, she recognised that black people needed, quote, to be seen and to be heard. Therefore, the new CPAG was composed of younger radicals and older, more maybe culturally conservative maternal figures who had not yet involved themselves in any form of militancy. Therefore, the organisation, led by women, represented a community united in the face of discrimination from the state, even in the form of the classroom. So regardless of their background, their age, they all came together. Black power was also frequently referenced at the meeting of the CPAG, and under the leadership of Mrs. Stout and the influence of radical activists, the CPAG organised a strike for the 25th of June, in which nearly all of the black parents withdrew their children from Capel Street School and protested outside of its gates. Unfortunately, we have people from the strike with us today. The strike was unprecedented in Leeds and actually quite a rare occurrence in British education across the country. The Education Department declared that they would make significant concessions only 2 days later. So if we think about how long the current strikes have been going on for, this strike only needed to last 1 day and the department was ready to give in. And this included replacing Mr. Butler, the racist head teacher. They actually moved him to a different school. So this is an example of the left-wing militancy that, quote, just ordinary housewives, according to Calvin Beach, engaged in, as well as the usual Black Panthers that we're more familiar with. There was a line, however, which Caribbean older women drew when they involved themselves in radical activity. So the minutes of the CPAG's meetings note that Mrs. Odessa Stout declared, "We are only talking about a bad school," when young radical activist Imu Bakari, formerly Errol Caesar, suggested that they apply all Black Power principles to aspects of their lives. This suggests that many women within the CPAG perceived their engagement in militancy as temporary. In this instance, older women agreed with the use of more forceful methods to protect their children, but that didn't necessarily, for example, local Caribbean activist Mrs. Yueli Pogba, as an assistant community relations officer at the Community Relations Council, voiced concerns over the nature of the action against the school. During an interview with a local newspaper, she reportedly agreed that the racist head teacher should resign, but believed that, quote, many parents approach him wrongly. These disagreements over what constituted appropriate and inappropriate resistance against the state eventually led to big disputes between the community activists in later years. So the Studley Grange takeover of 1972 and the Capel Street school strike of 1973 are perhaps two examples of a softer form of militancy. However, the Bonfire Night uprising a few years later was the community's first example of mass violence in the streets against representatives of the state. So on the 5th of November in 1975, hundreds of young people attacked officers on the streets of Chapeltown because the police had refused to limit their overt surveillance of black youngsters during the bonfire celebrations. 11 black boys and a white man were singled out by the police officers and put on trial as scapegoats. However, a defence committee came together to organise representation for the youngsters. Representation that included a well-known anti-racist barrister who many of you might know, Rudy Narayan. Girls had been involved in the violence of the 5th of November to a limited extent because many of them were not allowed to attend some of the bonfire gatherings, especially because the Yorkshire Ripper had just murdered his first known victim, Wilma McCann, a few days prior in Chapeltown. But the Defence Committee was mainly composed of women who had participated in the school strike 2 years ago, such as Mrs. Gertrude Paul, Viola Hendrickson, Niall Ward, and Annette Liebert. The fact that these women were not visible in the violence of Bonfire Night, but were overrepresented within the committee organised for the defence of the boys on trial, is another example of the duties of care and responsibility attached to women in the community. However, the women on the committee initially struggled to garner support within the community because many of the older Caribbean neighbours disapproved of the use of violence by the youth. It was an extreme form of militancy against the state that they were uncomfortable with. As explained by Viola Hendrickson in an oral history interview, quote, "You have to understand where they're coming from. The older generation were law-abiding, coming out of the harsh lives that they lived in the Caribbean. We, coming through as young people, would probably, maybe in naivety some of it, or feeling that sense of injustice that this isn't fair, this isn't right. We were more outspoken than our parents. So there may have been some who would not give their support to the young people because they would just see it as unruly behaviour," end quote. So the United Caribbean Association, which was the main organisation for people of Caribbean descent in Chapeltown, released a statement declaring, "We regret the unfortunate incidents on bonfire night." Whereas many younger people believed that the elders didn't really understand the issues of police brutality that many of the youth faced on the streets in the 1970s. Members of the Young Radical Uhuru Arts Group later challenged the softer position of the UCA with their statement, quote, "If we are attacked, then we are left with no alternative but to defend ourselves," end quote. They believed that sometimes the community needed to be militant in order to protect itself against the state. Nonetheless, it is important to recognise the older women within the neighbourhood, such as Mrs. Paul, who disapproved of the violence used by the youth, but supported those on trial regardless. While Mrs. Paul disagreed with their means of protest, these were the same children that she had taught at the UCA supplementary school, or who she had sought to protect through her concealed involvement in the Cowper Street school strike 2 years prior. She offered her house as a meeting place for the barristers and members of the Race Today collective based in London, who came to report on the trial. And in her oral history interview, the fabulous Naya Ward, a member of the Defence Committee, recalled other older women in the community, such as Mrs. Adams, being, quote, "very active, cooking food, making sure that the mandem had somewhere to sleep, and just generally making sure that they were safe when they were here in this community," end quote. On one occasion, the judge actually denied bail for the defendants because he believed that the charges against them were too severe. Thus, many of the young defendants, mostly between the ages of 15 and 19, had to spend the night in a jail cell while the solicitors secured their release. And during that night, the women within the community cooked food and brought it to the cells for these youngsters. So these women put aside their personal feelings about violence against the state, as well as their opinions as mothers within the community, assuming a maternal role not only for the young men on trial, but for those who came to assist the community from outside of Leeds in its time of need. While the mainstream history books will neglect their stories, their contributions as maternal figures were actually central to political developments in Chapeltown, as the Defence Committee would have been unsuccessful without such support behind the scenes. The local newspaper Chapeltown News reported that the community celebrated the acquittal of the majority, but not all, of the defendants on the 11th of July 1976. And despite the initial struggles to garner widespread support from the defendants, support for those on trial had dramatically increased over the months, and there were celebrations outside of the town hall. Therefore, the contributions of women to the Defence Committee, either through providing care for the defendants and solicitors, or helping draft letters and banners of support, these all significantly helped the solicitors secure such a rare result within the courtroom. This was during a time when most black men were just sent straight to jail, they weren't acquitted rarely. So this presentation has documented the role that women played within community activism, a role that was often gendered by the Association of Women with a Maternal Function. Some women, those who either were politically activists or those who were just ordinary housewives, to borrow Beach's phrasing, they stepped forward to defend young people, whether it be the children who were being taught by racist teachers or the teenagers and young adults who were fed up with encountering hostility from the police. The gendered expectations attached to women within the community ensured that the care of children was often perceived as their responsibility. As a result, some women on occasion utilised or supported confrontational means such as strikes and uprisings in the name of the children and youngsters of the community. Therefore, activism in Leeds should be used as an example of the multitude of ways in which women campaign for their rights and the rights of black people in Britain. It can help us consider how engagement in different forms of activism is often more fluid than we describe. These case studies revealed that some women agreed with the rhetoric of black power when they sought to challenge a racist school, but they didn't really engage further with it, or they didn't support the violence of the bonfire night incident. Therefore, we and historians more broadly should remember that just because one person was involved in one radical act, that's not always an indicator of their political views. Militant action, it wasn't always carried out with violence or solely by young men in black leather jackets wielding AK-47s. Sometimes it was carried out by older women in skirts in between working a job and looking after their families. Perhaps these conclusions can help us reconsider how we label activists and their activism, which would strengthen our understanding of how resistance operated in the 1970s. If you'd like to know more about my work, I have written an article on the Bonfire Night Uprising for History Today magazine and a blog post about the process of conducting my research for Women's History Network. Both are available to read online for free. My chapter on black women and the politics of community activism in Chapeltown in the 1970s will be published later this year in a collection on black British histories edited by Professor Hakeem Addy. So that's me finished with the presentation. But I just wanted to share some of these photographs with you. I'll go through them. Because these were recently discovered by Historic England. They're actually photographs of the West Indian Centre in April 1983. They've been previously unseen. And we're going to put together a workshop or some kind of event at the West Indian Centre, hopefully sometime in October. Invite you all in to take a look at these pictures. We're going to be conducting oral history interviews as well to try and capture recollections of the event and also just histories of Chapeltown in general. So I thought I'd just share some of them with you so you can have a look, but there's actually maybe 50 to 60 photographs altogether. And as you can see, they're quite fantastic. I'm really looking forward to sharing these with you. So I just thought I'd advertise briefly. If you'd like to know more information, let me know. But the details are still to be confirmed. I don't actually know if I'm meant to speak about it yet, but I'm doing it anyway. So there we are. But thank you very much.